Our last speaker, again from the Army Corps of Engineers, is Arijs Rakstins. Arijs is the Deputy District Engineer for Project Management at the San Francisco District. I think many of you are well aware of Arijs. He's been there a very long time. He started, I think, in '78. He's been there my entire career, Arijs, I think, as it turns out. But one thing I think is really going to follow on the earlier discussion we've had just finished, and that is he's going to talk about various range of cost-sharing possibilities that exist or could exist to really help support projects in the region. So, Arijs, welcome again.
Thanks, Jim. And how much time do I have, John, roughly?
20 minutes, because we need to be out of here by no later than a quarter of.
Okay.
There's another meeting in here.
Actually, in the last half hour, I've completely redone my presentation. Because what I sense today, my slides are kind of dry. They have to do with the mechanics of financing, navigation projects in particular, because the Corps' primarily relationship with the coalition started with navigation. So I chose that as, and you saw that through Dave's presentation and Tom's too. But what I heard today is what you're all about is not so much studying on how the Corps does stuff, but trying to figure out how to finance the Corps projects from the federal perspective, from the local perspective. So some of my slides are going to, in fact, can you go to the other one? Can you go to navigation first?
Oh, sure.
Yeah. Some of these slides are going to be just kind of subliminal blasts, and you can go to the coalition website to look at them in detail. I also submitted to Ariel a primer put out by the Congressional Research Service on Corps authorities and appropriations, a 10-page pamphlet. It's got a lot more detail. I think that's going to be on your website as well. So what I'm going to do as I go through these slides, I'm going to sort of pass over the mechanical algorithms on cost sharing, but talk really about some slides that might affect the strategy that the coalition and other groups like you use in trying to keep Corps projects going. So it'll be a little bit different from what you might expect. So let's go to the next slide. Just quickly, this is the basis of the Corps navigation mission. That's our mission statement for navigation. It's interesting, this presentation is from headquarters, but there are a lot of San Francisco Bay Area slides that I didn't know were selected by the headquarters for this briefing. This is the briefing that's given to all the new Corps district commanders. There's 41 of them each year at Corps headquarters. So next slide, please. This is sort of the seminal authority for the cost sharing on navigation. Dave alluded to some of that. It's the 1986 Water Resource Development Act. Next slide. Our basic navigation mission derives from the Commerce Clause of the Constitution to provide efficient navigation for the nation, but we also have a national defense component that we serve as well. Next slide. The Corps navigation mission is the oldest mission in the Corps of Engineers. We have, in civil works, we have three primary business lines that Len referred to: navigation, flood control, or flood risk management, it's now called, and environmental restoration. Navigation is the oldest. It makes up roughly 1/3 of our total civil works program each year, which right now is a little less than $5 billion a year. Navigation between construction and maintenance makes up about 1/3 of that. So it's a big program. About 21% new construction, the rest is maintenance funding. For San Francisco District, where I work, we get about $30 million a year for the navigation program. So it's roughly about 1/3 of our total workload. Next slide. Interesting headquarters slide. It's all just some of the ports, some of the major ports that we work in around the country. Richmond and Oakland are highlighted there. But the relationship in this business, the navigation business, and the Corps involvement in that goes far beyond just Northern California, where I work, or the Bay Area. You know, our project managers will go work for the Port of New York, New Jersey, and executive directors from Oakland will go and work down in Jacksonville, right, and Baltimore. So it's really, it's a national community that we work within. Next slide. Now, what is the navigation system in the United States? These are the different things that make up the program that we support, and later the slides go into the cost sharing of these things. There's channels, there's coastal protection, training basins, locks in the Midwest, the middle part of the U.S., local service facilities, which are the berthing facilities that gets material from the federal channel to the docks, and then there's the dredge material disposal sites, and both Dave and Tom referred to some of those. Next slide. These are the federal responsibilities: channels, jetties, anchorages, breakwaters, locks, disposal sites, and aids to navigation. Again, here Crescent City pops up. So earlier, this picture of the bay. Here we have Crescent City, another harbor that we support in Northern California. This is a federal responsibility. It's not the Corps of Engineers. It's aids to navigation. So in all our projects where you see financing for sponsor responsibility, Corps responsibility, there's also a Coast Guard responsibility that comes into play. Next slide. Non-federal responsibilities in terms of the navigation improvements. You cost share in the construction. There's a cost share requirement in certain maintenance aspects. Sponsors have to provide lands, LERs, lands, easements, rights-of-ways, and relocations, and local service facilities, which are basically berthing areas, bulkheads, docks, things of that nature. Here's a little more detail on what local responsibilities are towards federal navigation projects. Docks, berthing areas, local access channels. The Corps will not build sub-channels to single beneficiaries. That falls to local responsibilities. I'll get into more of that later. Back up just one second. The last point's important, that our contribution has to be available to everyone. We cannot service single-user facilities. It has to be maybe one operator. It has to be open to the public, to all users of the federal channel. Next slide. This is very quickly the cost sharing for navigation improvements. It varies by depth. The first number is your essential upfront cost sharing. The second number can be paid over time, over 30 years, and also any local requirements like lands, easements, rights-of-way can be credited towards that second 10%. So as you see in construction, the cost share increases as you get deeper. Mitigation in terms of if we're constructing a new federal channel for the Port of Richmond and we take out a wetland, that wetland has to be replaced somewhere. That cost sharing is the same as for the navigation channel construction. It said local service facilities are 100% on the sponsors, Port of Oakland, Port of Richmond, New York, New Jersey Port Authority, Port of Jacksonville, whatever. And again, that LRDs, lands, easements, rights-of-way, are also 100% local responsibility. Next slide. Operations and maintenance, as Dave pointed out, up to 45 feet, it's on the federal government. After that, it's shared 50-50 with the local sponsor. But the footnote to that, and correct me if I'm wrong, Dave, that 50-50 is the increase over a project that would have been limited to 45 feet. Yeah. Is that correct? So it's the incremental change beyond 45 feet in maintenance cost that's cost shared 50-50 with local sponsors. Again, aids to navigation is not a local responsibility, it's a Coast Guard responsibility, but you are responsible for berthing areas, bulkheads, docks, things of that nature, bollards, things of that nature. Next slide. As I said earlier, any land requirement or relocation requirement, Port of Oakland, if you're relocating phone lines, electrical lines for the federal channel deepening, the cost of that can be credited towards that additional 10%, over and above the initial cost share that the sponsors have to provide. Relocations, they're typically utilities, but they can also be business relocations. For example, Oakland Turning Basin, we took out fast land as part of the project construction to widen the turning area. The businesses that resided on that fast land had to be relocated. That relocation cost was responsibility for Port of Oakland. Let's go to the next slide. Both Richard and Dave Tom talked about some of the programs that are going beyond traditional navigation improvement into other business areas, primarily environmental restoration. Across the country, they take different forms. Land creation, for example, St. Paul District of Corps is recreating islands in Green Bay that have been eroded over time using dredge material. Beach nourishment is not that common up here in Northern California. There's some of it going on in Southern California. It's more common down in the southeast and the East Coast. Mitigation and restoration, particularly using dredge material, has become very effective here in the Bay Area. We have 3 major wetland restoration projects using dredge material. Sonoma Baylands in Sonoma County, Hamilton Airfield in Marin County, and the private Montezuma Wetland Project up near Collinsville. All are using dredge material from federal navigation projects. Next slide. Again, beach nourishment cost sharing, we don't do a lot of that up in Northern California. It is allowable under certain authorities. We are working on one project that's actually going to try and go outside these authorities for protection of ocean beach using dredge material. We're in the study phase for that. Next slide. As I said earlier, wetland creation using dredge material is very popular now. It's very effective. Richard talked about that also at the Oakland Middle Harbor. I guess the point I would make on this slide, getting back to my opening remarks, is the last bullet on multi-purpose, because that really speaks to the aspect of coalition. One of the strategies in securing financing on the federal budget side is to, I believe, cross different business lines, where you can suggest that a project is addressing not only navigation, but flood control and wetland restoration. You then can address three basic federal objectives that, in my opinion, is more effective than a single business line. For example, for the Santa Clara Valley Water District, which is not, on the surface of it, a navigation sponsor, they're a flood risk management sponsor. They're involved in sponsoring the South San Francisco Bay Shoreline Study with the Corps, with our office, which is dual purpose, wetland restoration and flood risk management. However, the restoration component possibly could use material in the South Bay because there's a material deficit if you want to restore wetlands to historic elevations. So what's an available source of fill material? Dredging. Dredging from Oakland, dredging from Richmond, dredging from Redwood City. If there's some way to cobble together a coalition, using your term, that can address the national benefits of doing all those things, you can be in the position of securing financing not just from the navigation business line of the Corps, but from the flood risk management business line and the environmental business line. So that's one strategy. We could have a whole nother workshop on federal financing strategies, which we may or may not be able to participate in, but that's something we need to think about. So, next slide. I mentioned earlier about the single user. We don't have to dwell on that. Single user beneficiaries are not allowed. Next slide. I wanted to touch on some unique, maybe lesser used authorities. The first one, we have some authorities to remove obstructions to navigation. Len's famous minesweeper in Oakland Harbor. There was a minesweeper that was sinking close to the federal channel. We have authority to remove that. We tried to sell it on eBay. It didn't work. So we picked it up and demolished it. We call it Len's minesweeper. And there's some other minor authorities. Second from the bottom, we're dealing with a small project out at Pillar Point, where one of our old breakwaters may have exacerbated shoreline erosion. We then have authority to go in and fix the problem we created back in the 1960s. Next slide. Takeaway points. Again, navigation is really the foundation and the origin of the Corps Civil Works mission. Local sponsors have a certain fiscal responsibility if they want to secure federal funds for navigation improvements. And lastly, we can and should focus on authorities we have for multiple use of dredge material and how that might further the entire program of federal channel improvements. So, now I have another shorter brief. Do we have time to do that one too? Okay, John asked me to do something on maybe a little lesser used federal authority, but one that there is some financing available. It's called Planning Assistance to States. You can pull that one up. Go ahead, next slide. It's basically an authority to help finance locals addressing technical issues. Not a construction authority, it's a technical assistance authority. Next slide. It has to do broadly with civil works and water-related problems. Sponsors typically are just like you all, ports, cities, counties, joint powers authorities, sometimes tribes. Next slide. It's a relatively small program. I think, Tom, it's still about $2 million per state. Is that still our general limit, or is it different than that? I seem to think that's about the same. There's not a lot of use of this authority, at least in the Bay Area. We have done it a couple times in recent years. It's a 50-50 cash match. There are certain cases, which we haven't tested yet, where it can be 100% federal on certain unique issues at the bottom of the slide. I don't know, Tom, are you familiar with that?
Comment on it hasn't been used that much in large part because the practice locally has been to kind of remember the DWR, and DWR candidly has sort of a central bias, what am I say, the center stage, central bound thinking. But their DWR is getting much more holistic in their view, and so they really are trying to do their work more out in our region now as well. I think that'll have some bearing on how
And this is the kind of work that we can do under this authority. Again, it's a 50-50. You know, sponsors have to provide a 50% cash match. Ones we've done recently, we did a hydraulic study of Redwood Creek up in Del Norte County. Is that Del Norte County? A few years before, we did a study for the city of Emeryville. They had a contaminated plume under a redevelopment area in the city, and we got a cold call one day saying, "Can the Corps help with this?" So we had certain equipment out on the East Coast. We could come out and through laser technology do an assessment of this contaminated plume under the city of Emeryville. So it's a fairly unique study. We don't do that often, but it's a resource that's available to sponsors. Next slide. Basically, it's a letter request to the Corps. If you have a technical issue that you feel we might have a unique capability to assist with, and you can always call us, and our numbers are all available, I think, through your website, to see if there's something you'd like to do, and that starts the process. Next slide. Again, $2 million per state. We try to finish within a year. It's not a construction authority. It's very little management. It's not necessarily passed through to consultants, but oftentimes we can use consultants in these studies. Next slide. And these are typical sponsors that I talk. It has to be a state chartered agency. It cannot be, you know, a for-profit entity. Next slide. Again, some of the types of things we've done around the country: water quality studies in Wisconsin, stream bed degradation, hydraulic studies, floodplain mapping. Next slide. And that's pretty much it. Just gives our dollar limit, and you work with us, and we try and get you some money. That's about it. So now we can go on. That's pretty much it.
I was just handed a card for a question based on your planning assistance for states.
Sure.
$2 million is available to each state and tribe, you mentioned. How much is actually available in California right now in this fiscal year?
I think it's $2 million out of the program for each particular state.
Right.
So each district, like us, would have to apply for a piece of that pot, whatever's available. And we really don't check on the availability of funding until we get a request.
So okay, at this point, it's unknown out of the $2 million how much might be or might not be
I don't know
It's
if
like
it's
$10,000.
Tens of thousands of dollars. Okay, great, thank you.